Mr. Gupta, I'm very sorry. We're a little pressed on time. The Finance Minister is speaking at the IEC. Let's cut across to that.
As soon as possible, which actually implies in simple language that we have to almost double the size of our economy in the next few years. Now, of course, we must keep some bare realities in mind. And those realities, inter alia, include the fact that we are globally no longer in a high-growth economic era. A high-growth economic era was a period between 2003 and 2008 when the global economy grew much faster, and therefore during that boom period, a lot of economies which conventionally grew at a moderate level also grew faster. And if we have the experience of the Chinese economy over the previous 30 years, 3 decades, they grew at an approximate rate of 9%. But I think today in the world, a 9% growth rate for a country which has a reasonable base is not really so easy to achieve. To achieve that, you will have to have an extraordinary domestic story coupled with some tailwinds coming from the global growth itself. Now, those tailwinds, as far as the global growth is concerned, don't seem to be so visible. Additionally, if we look at the situation of challenges, we live in a world where you have uncertainties. Trade war creates an uncertainty. Unforeseen events like the Brexit create an uncertainty. The hardening of the dollar for many economies creates an uncertainty. The fluctuating oil prices, particularly for net buyers like India, if they move up, create an uncertainty. Now, it is in the midst of these global challenges that we have to really steer our economy on a high growth path. Now, when we have to steer it on a high growth path, I think the fundamentals to be kept in mind are that are we to concentrate on sound policy or are we to momentarily get swayed by mere populism? Mere populism may, on a solitary occasion, earn you some advantages, but then it is not going to lead to a sound direction as far as the economy is concerned. Now, if you look at what has happened in the last few years, I think if we look at the India growth story, it has been quite good. Certainly, we would have hoped for something much better if the global environment was also favorable. We have the satisfaction of having an economy which is faster than any other economy in terms of growth amongst the major economies in the world. I don't think compared to the last 4 to 5 years, we've ever had macros of this kind, that where we have inflation under control in the 3–3.5% range. We have a fiscal deficit which is on a glide path gradually coming down. We have large foreign exchange reserves. We have by and large kept our current account deficit under control, except for the brief 6–7 month period when the oil prices again started skyrocketing. And now, fortunately, since there seems to be a trend downwards, I do hope we will be able to improve upon that figure also as far as the CAD is concerned. In the midst of all this, I think what we really need to concentrate on is, when I said policy, it means let us continue with the reform agenda that we've had. At times you tend to slow down on the reform agenda because of the political situations which exist in the country, but never should we fall to the temptation of ever reversing that agenda. Secondly, when you move on that reform agenda, it is ultimately in the long run going to show you good results. For instance, all that we've done over the last few years has certainly resulted in a situation that we are somewhere around a 7.4% growing economy over the last several years. And if we can improve upon that rate and move towards a 8% economy over the next few years and maybe try to exceed that figure, I think our target of reaching a $5 trillion economy over the next few years will become a realizable dream. What do we do in order to carry on this agenda? I think there are several unreformed sectors in the economy, and we must keep those basic parameters in mind and look at those unreformed sectors where we need to move forward. We must never fall to the temptation of sheer populism, because that will be short-lived. That is not going to eventually bring you results in the long term. And I think it's also important that we've seen the benefit over the last 4 to 5 years of additional revenues coming into the pockets of the exchequer because of the high growth rates that you have. And that money is really to be spent, one, on infrastructure. Obviously, the governments have to service themselves. They have to spend a lot on their own salaries, pensions, repayment of loans, servicing of the debt, on defense expenditure, etc. And a large part of it really has to be spent on the social sectors and on rural India, which are the areas where growth really has to still pick up. I believe for the next 2 decades, that's 20 years, our agenda should be clearly laid out. We continue to improve upon our infrastructure. We continue to improve upon the quality of life in urban areas. We need to have more cities and townships, because they really become the engines of growth. And we need to spend a lot on these areas. At the same time, I think our spending on healthcare, our spending on education, both at the level of the center and the state governments, will really have to be increased. Even a program of some expenditure like Ayushman Bharat, in the first 3 months, we've just had 5 lakh people who got their hospital treatment free from amongst the 40% poorest sections of Indian population. And rest of it, we really have to invest in the urban poor and into the rural India. We've seen that experiment over the last few years, building roads, building houses, educational institutions, electrifications, irrigation, the sanitation facilities, amenities of a modern urban-like livelihood to them. Cooking gas was one symbolic improvement in their quality of life itself. And if we can keep investing year after year in these areas, I think you still have at least 4 areas that I can see where a lot of investment is required, where growth will naturally occur. The first, of course, is infrastructure. Coupled with it, you'll need more townships. The second is rural India. Future growth has to really come in from there. The third area is going to be gender, as far as the participation of women in the economic life of the country. We are seeing increases in women education, in their health, and in their reach to more regular forms of employment. And then geographically, of course, it's the eastern parts of India which are quite agriculture rich, which are mineral rich, but where the growth rates have never been so high, which need to be exploited to the fullest, so that we can look at these areas as future engines of growth itself. And I think if we can retain this agenda for the next 20 odd years, India's ability to get rid of poverty, to elevate itself to a developed economy, and in the meanwhile, over the course of the next few years, I am reasonably certain in the next decade sometimes, middle or later part, we should be targeting reaching the $5 trillion economy mark, which you've set as an agenda as far as this conference of yours is concerned. That's all I had to say in terms of my opening comments. And if there's any clarification in the terms of your interaction, I'll be too pleased to clarify that.
Well, big round of applause for the Finance Minister. Before I get down to the real questions, and Finance Minister, thank you very much for charting out a long-term plan for the country, the economic road that India needs to follow. And I'm sure this audience would be extremely delighted to hear that despite the recent political upheavals in the state elections, you've talked about being fiscally disciplined, and you're not going to fall to the temptation of giving out doles and freebies. But Mr. Jaitley, may I ask you, and let's begin, as you said in your opening remarks, that there are political situations in the country. Mr. Jaitley, with these 5 state election results, do you think the path that's been followed by your government is going to change in terms of the economic direction, the commitment to reforms that you've held so far?
Well, when I used that sentence, I had in mind a situation that a lot of reforms take place on the basis of a larger consensus. Now, obviously, on the eve of elections, consensus in India is not so easy. It's much easier in the life of a government in the first, second, and third year, or maybe in the fourth year. Never on the election eve. That's all I had in mind. But let me tell you, I certainly would not agree with you when you use the word freebies and doles. I think rural India and the Indian poor have to be helped. Are they to be helped in terms of mere slogans, or are they to be helped in terms of resources? And if they are to be helped in terms of resources, how do you give those resources? I do believe that governments in the past have given a lot of slogans to them. I today checked up the figure that those who have given slogans, have they really lived up to it? Now, every state government which has promised it before the election to give some kinds of a dole or the freebies, as you choose to call them, subsequent to the elections, barring one or two of those state governments, the others have failed to deliver because their fiscal health did not permit them to deliver. On the contrary, a model which we have followed as far as the central government is concerned, I can count the number of facilities we have given to them, but none of them is going to be a dole or a freebie. It is the utilization of the government's resources for poverty eradication. Let us see in terms of financial inclusion. We made sure that they get connected to the banks. We made sure that they get low-cost insurance policies. We made sure that they get low-interest mudra loans. 13 crore people got that. 33 crore people got connected to the bank accounts itself. Now look at the quality of life in rural areas. We've made sure that every village gets a road. We tripled the investment on rural roads. Our Gramin Awas Yojana, the rural housing, we are now building about 50 lakh houses every year in rural areas to give it to the weakest section of the population. Oh, by 2022, if this pace goes on, every poor man in a village will have a regular house. We made sure that all the 700,000 villages have electricity. We are now targeting and are in the final stages, almost 95 to 97% of the people, homes have electricity. The balance 3-4% homes are going to be connected within the next few weeks. When the Prime Minister announced Swachh Bharat, rural sanitation was 39%. Today it is in excess of 96%. You've now made sure that out of the 8 crore houses, close to 8 crore poor houses, approximately 6 crore already have a cooking gas connection. You've made sure that the 10 crore households, the poorest 10 crore out of the 25 crore households in India, get hospital treatment free in India. Now, these are not doles or freebies. These are effective poverty eradication steps which are adding to the improved quality in rural areas amongst the weaker sections of the people. Now, this is sound policy as against populism. What I said was that these are very popular programs, but these are based on a sound policy, and if we continue on this path for the next 1 or 2 decades and keep investing into our rural areas in this manner, in irrigation and other areas, we'll probably be able to pull up the life of people in rural areas and bring it as close as we can to an urban quality.
So, Mr. Jaitley, to what would you put down the defeat of the BJP in the 3 Hindi heartland states of Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh? All these schemes that you're talking about were there in these states as well. Why has the message not gone across to the voters?
Well, let us be very clear. At times, victories and defeats are always exaggerated. And on the first 3-4 days, the initial extent, it gets exaggerated even more. Look at a state like Madhya Pradesh. Madhya Pradesh was a Bimaru state in 2003 when the BJP came to power. If you remember the 2003 election, the issues were basic. The issues were Bijli, Sadak and Pani, the BSP as they called them. Madhya Pradesh agriculture didn't have water. Madhya Pradesh didn't have urban or rural electricity. Madhya Pradesh was the worst state in terms of roads. 15 years later, we transformed Madhya Pradesh. Madhya Pradesh got out of the Bimaru status. Madhya Pradesh started progressing. In fact, it was one of the fastest growing states. If you look at agriculture on the strength of water and electricity that we provided to rural Madhya Pradesh, it's had 20% growth, 18% growth, 17% growth in agriculture, which was unprecedented. So I still maintain, and I firmly maintain, I reiterate that we did exceedingly well in these 15 years that we were in power in Madhya Pradesh. Now in Madhya Pradesh, when you call it a defeat, well, it was almost a dead heat. In fact, we've got a fraction of a percent vote more than the Congress. So when you have huge anti-incumbencies, you get reduced by a margin of 10-12%. You get about 23 seats as Congress got in Rajasthan, or 38 seats that Congress got in Rajasthan in 2000, or in Madhya Pradesh in 2003. We narrowly missed it, even though our vote percentage was higher. Now this can be on account of several factors. It can be on account of a fatigue factor in a state. It can be on account of certain caste equations and a misunderstanding on certain steps taken by the government, which were quite evident in Madhya Pradesh. This could be on account of certain local factors, a candidate level anti-incumbency. So please don't equate a marginal defeat as something which is a rejection of a policy, because the marginal defeat also was accompanied by a vote which is marginally higher than the Congress. Now look at Rajasthan. We were being told in Rajasthan that we are going to be routed. Of the last 6 governments in Rajasthan before this election, we've been in power 4 times out of 6. Now we were, instead of a rout which was being predicted, we came within 0.5% of the popular vote in Rajasthan. Now the difference between our popular vote wasn't difference. There is a 23 seat, 26 seat difference as far as number of seats are concerned. There were several factors, local anti-incumbency, etc., which were operating against us. But I think we are at a position where we don't require a wholesale change as far as our policy is concerned, because I think our policy is certainly a high growth and a pro-poor policy. This policy is sound for the states. This policy is sound for the country. Otherwise, you will land up in a situation where you make these populist announcements. Look at the test case of a comparative Congress state like Punjab. You made these announcements in Punjab. You found yourself being caught between 2 stools. You were unable to implement the promise. And as a result of the populism, you are unable to spend today any money as far as development is concerned. Capital expenditure this year in a state like Punjab has come down to a rock bottom, because the policy being followed across the governments in Punjab has been more populism than one based in sound policy.
So, Mr. Jaitley, the other attack on you as finance minister and on your government is about the destruction of institutions. And let me bring up the recent resignation of the RBI Governor Urjit Patel. We spoke on Frankly Speaking just a few days ago, Mr. Jaitley, and at that time you said that the government would never get into a confrontation situation with the RBI. Today I want to ask you, Mr. Jaitley, did Urjit Patel resign because of the confrontation? And the opposition says that you've chosen now a rubber stamp as a replacement, a man who's been a finance secretary under you. Respond to that criticism of the opposition.
Well, let me first of all take a very serious objection to the kind of comment you've made about the new governor. In fact, you are the one holding the institution in disgrace, not us. So I think you should restrain from using a phrase of this kind for either a past governor or a present governor. Now, coming to the question of the RBI is a very important institution in the life of this country. The RBI is an institution of great credibility. The RBI's independence and autonomy does exist within the framework of law, and it's an institution whose autonomy and independence has to be respected because it has benefited the country. Now, having an opinion different is not confrontation. I think Indian media, in its hyper-journalism, converts every discussion and 2 conflicting opinions as an area of confrontation. For example, if you look at the history of the RBI, you've had several incidents in the past where governments have had a different view from what the RBI has had. And then those differences either get settled or the governors have made way. Now, we had a particular opinion on 2 or 3 major issues, and I think the immediate issues were relating to credit as far as the credit in the market is concerned, and issues relating to liquidity in the market. Now, every person involved in some kind of a business activity, whether it's the financial sector or the manufacturing sector or services or in the MSME sectors or even in agriculture, will tell you that they were facing difficulties as far as credit and liquidity is concerned. We are the sovereign government. We are the most important stakeholder as far as the management of the economy is concerned. And therefore, a discussion with an important institution which is independent and autonomous, to tell it that it's a part of your functions, and therefore this is one area of the economy which you must seriously look at. How is it destruction of the institution? After all, the RBI has the responsibility as far as credit and liquidity is concerned. We are not addressing a third institution. We are not taking over that function. Therefore, at all levels, meetings and discussions with me, between the bureaucracy, at the level of the Prime Minister and in the board, and using all instruments of discussions available with us to force this issue for a discussion as a sovereign accountable government, that we find this problem is real as far as the Indian economy is concerned, and therefore in order to maintain our place as a high growth economy, this is a problem which the RBI must address. How is it an issue of confrontation? And therefore, I think if the government of the day is not able to convey the difficulties that are felt in the system, it would certainly be failing in its responsibility as far as the government is concerned. Don't forget what our first Prime Minister, Pandit Nehru, had written to the then RBI governor, when he said, the economic policy of the country is determined by the elected government. The RBI's monetary policy functions are autonomous and independent. But other policies of the RBI certainly must be in tandem with the economic policy of the country which has developed. Now, supposing there is an economic policy of all successive governments that the MSME sector has to be encouraged, can a credit policy of India be, no, we will not give credit to the MSMEs? And therefore, in such situations, the autonomous institutions also have to be informed that there is some difficulty which is arising in the system and that requires to be corrected. Therefore, please don't give the kind of hype to it and say it's a confrontation, it's a destruction of institution. Well, if you call it a destruction of institution, then as one of the famous authors on the RBI put the title of his book, it will be a dialogue of the deaf, because you won't be then giving the concerns to each other and not listening to each other. But in live democracies, concerns of the market and the economy have to be addressed and have to be communicated. Now, as far as the present governor is concerned, let me tell you, if you look at the history of Indian governors in the RBI, Dr. C.D. Deshmukh was an officer of the Indian Civil Service. Mr. B. Bengaru Ramarao was an officer of the Indian Civil Service. Thereafter, you had several officers who have been, Mr. R.N. Malhotra was an Indian Civil Services officer. Before that, Mr. Y.V. Reddy was an Indian Administrative Service officer. Mr. Subbarao was an IAS officer. And therefore, if we start denigrating every institution for an officer who has had 35 years of experience or more as far as the economic management of the country is concerned, so we start calling them rubber stamps, then I think Indian media is probably doing more damage to the institution than anybody else in the system.
Well, Mr. Jaitley, Mr. Jaitley, I hope you heard the round of applause you got for that answer that you gave. But Mr. Jaitley, may I just put on record that that was the line used by the Congress party. It is Mr. Rahul Gandhi who tweeted and said in his press conference. So instead of shooting the messenger, Mr. Jaitley, may I ask you, what would be your response to Rahul Gandhi?
Well, can I stop you at that? Navika, can I stop you at that for a moment?
I've stopped, sir.
Prime Minister Nehru asked Governor Ramarao to resign. Then you came, Mrs. Indira Gandhi asked Governor Jagannathan to resign. Thereafter, you had Mr. Yashwant Sinha who asked Governor R.N. Malhotra to resign. Then you had, during Mr. Chidambaram's tenure, 2 governors with whom he was not even at speaking terms. But we've had, otherwise, I've worked with 2 governors and I've had the best of relationship with both of them, even though I may not have agreed with them on many issues.
Well, Mr. Jaitley, before I let you go, I want to ask you the last question. Many say the personal attacks against Rahul Gandhi have probably made him a bigger leader than he actually was perceived by the people. So in the run-up to 2019, Mr. Jaitley, will we continue to see a head-on collision between Rahul Gandhi and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, or is the BJP going to step back and change its strategy?
Well, let me, Navika, again mention this. What are the personal attacks? You comment on politics, that's not a personal attack. If there is anybody indulging in personal attacks in this country, it is Mr. Rahul Gandhi and his supporters. The Prime Minister's mother is not spared. His deceased father, who died 40 years ago, is not spared. My children who are not in politics are not spared. Now, he goes to this extent every day in the conduct of his politics, and therefore personalizes every attack and then says, oh, there are personal attacks on me. There are attacks on his policy, there are attacks on the quality of politics that he practices. I am one of those who don't believe in personal attacks, but certainly politics should be commented upon, not personalities or family members of politicians. And therefore, if anybody has started this trend, it is Mr. Rahul Gandhi himself to be blamed for this.
Well, Mr. Jaitley, one can never have the last word with you, but all this audience wants to know is the BJP still on target to form a majority government in 2019? Or are we looking at a coalition era where you will need more alliances to take on the Mahagathbandhan, which seems to be forming against you?
Well, let me tell you that it is this audience and people like them who have to decide who forms the government in 2009. May or June, as and when the government is formed. Your choices are very clear. That election is very different from what happens in the states at times. We lost Delhi Assembly badly, and within months, we swept the entire state of Delhi, all 7 seats, by lakhs of vote. We won the 2003 December elections in these 3 states itself. We lost the 2004 elections. State assemblies are always on a different footing. In the next election, the question is going to be very clear before the voter. One hand, you have a Prime Minister and a government which has been tested for its stability, its policies, its integrity, its ethics, and its decisiveness. On the other hand, you have what I call a coalition of rivals, a highly opportunistic combinations which has no clear policy, whose stability has always been in doubt, and where not even only the stability, whose policy direction itself has been in doubt. You will probably have partners in that. You will have partners in that government which are of 3 categories. One category believes that only their state interests have to be served and they want a special status for their states. And therefore, one by one, each one of the regional players will say, well, if you want a government and my support, declare my state as a special status. Secondly, you will have people who think my vote bank is going to be influenced by the fact if I go and support radicals of this particular kind. Then you will have the Rahul Gandhi type of politics, which will say, I don't believe in sound policy, I am only on transient populism, and therefore I have a negative politics of only abusing my rivals on a personal basis, and therefore I'll bring it up. And then you want a coalition of this kind, which will have political rivals. Now look at Telangana, how a coalition of rivals collapsed. You can fool some of the people some of the times, you can't fool them all the time. And this kind of a coalition will never last because people have tried it on 5 occasions in the past and have an experience that its longevity is not beyond a few months.
Well, Mr. Jaitley, difficult to argue.